Aerial shot, Idaho. The sawtooth peaks cutting white against a gray sky, a single campground road threading between the pines. One way in, one way out. People come here for the quiet, and sometimes the quiet keeps them. 10 people, 10 Idaho places. None of them ever came home. Pull up the map, lock your doors, let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases drop every week. July 10th, 2015, Timber Creek Campground, Lemhi County, Idaho. To find this place on a map, you have to want to find it. You drive east out of Palouse on a road that narrows as the altitude climbs, passing through a valley that opens wide and then pinches closed around you like a hand. The campground sits roughly 10 miles from the small town of Idaho, tucked into a fold of land where Timber Creek runs alongside the campsites and Stone Reservoir waits just a short walk beyond the tree line. The terrain here is not dramatic in the way that makes it onto postcards. It is quieter than that. Dense timber, high altitude, the kind of landscape where sound travels strangely and distance is brutally hard to judge. A child's voice would carry for a moment, then get absorbed by the trees the way all sound eventually does out here. There is one road in, there is one road out. The mountains don't particularly care which one you take. It was supposed to be a fishing trip. Nothing more complicated than that. Vernal Dior, Kunz Sr., had packed up the truck and headed out that week with his partner, Jessica Mitchell, their 2-year-old son, Dior Jr., Jessica's great-grandfather Robert Walton, and a family friend named Isaac Reinwand. 5 people total. A campsite beside a creek, cold enough at night that you'd need a jacket even in July, warm enough during the day to make you forget that the nearest town is a serious drive away. The kind of weekend that exists all across rural Idaho in the summer. Unremarkable, comfortable. The sort of trip that families take dozens of times without incident. Until suddenly, this one wasn't that. Here's the first thing you need to know about Dior Kunz Jr. He was 2 years old, just barely 2, and small even for his age. His parents called him Little Man. He was, by every account from people who knew him, the kind of small child who fills a space far larger than his physical size, loud, happy, constantly in motion, curious about everything within reach. And he never went anywhere without 3 things: his blanket, his sippy cup, and a small toy monkey. Those 3 objects functioned as a kind of toddler GPS system for the adults around him. Wherever those items were sitting, Dior was close behind, or had just been, or was about to return. It was one of those small but reliable patterns that parents of young children learn to read without thinking about it. So when the adults turned around that Thursday afternoon and saw all 3 items sitting exactly where they'd been left, undisturbed, arranged the way a toddler leaves things when he fully intends to come back, the bottom dropped out of everything before anyone had even finished scanning the tree line. But let's go back to the 45 minutes before that moment, because that window is where this entire case lives and has lived for a decade. Nobody saw him leave. That sounds, on its surface, like a simple failure. A 2-year-old wanders from a campsite in a moment of adult inattention. It happens. It is terrifying. It is a type of emergency that wilderness search teams train for specifically. Children move fast and quietly. Adults get pulled into the rhythm of the trip. And the gap between "he was right here" and "where did he go" can be shockingly small. Except this isn't quite that story. When investigators later worked to reconstruct the timeline leading up to the 911 call, what they found was not a single moment of inattention, but a gap in accountability that spread across every adult at the campsite. Each person, when pressed, had understood that one of the others had eyes on the boy. Vernal Sr. believed Robert Walton was watching Dior while the parents were occupied nearby. Robert Walton, who was in his 70s and had come on the trip largely as a passenger, believed the boy was with his parents. Jessica believed he was being watched. Nobody had said, "I've got him," out loud, and nobody had asked. In the space between those three assumptions, in the sound of the creek and the afternoon wind moving through the timber, a 2-year-old in a camouflage jacket, blue pajama pants, and cowboy boots that were a size too large for his feet ceased to be visible to any of them. Both parents called 911 at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. This is where it stops being normal. The response was immediate. Lemhi County Sheriff's deputies understood from the first transmission what they were dealing with. A toddler in remote mountain terrain, with a moving creek running directly alongside the campsite and a reservoir within walking distance, and dense timber pressing in from every direction. The window for a productive, warm search. The critical first hours when a missing child's trail is still fresh and their scent is still readable, was already beginning to close by the time the first units arrived. By the end of that first afternoon and into the evening, search crews were moving through the surrounding area on foot, on horseback, on ATVs. Helicopters worked the ridgelines above. K-9 units were deployed at ground level, given Dior's scent from items at the campsite, and sent out along every logical route away from the site, toward the creek, toward the reservoir, into the timber. They focused their attention on the water first, because water is always the first fear when a small child goes missing in this kind of terrain. They found nothing. Not a footprint at the creek's edge, not a displaced stone along the bank, not a scrap of camouflage fabric caught in the brush at toddler height. And here is the detail that kept dragging investigators back. Those cowboy boots were too big. On a 2-year-old navigating uneven ground near a creek, wearing boots that didn't fit quite right, the mechanics of movement alone should have produced evidence. Boots that size, on feet that small, pull free in thick undergrowth. They leave deeper heel impressions in soft ground near water. They slow a child down and make them clumsy in ways that leave marks. The K-9 units, working with a fresh scent source, could not establish a reliable trail leading away from the immediate campsite perimeter in any direction. The trail simply wasn't there, or something had destroyed it before the dogs arrived, which is its own category of answer. The animal theory was raised early and was never fully set aside. Idaho's backcountry in Lemhi County supports mountain lions and black bears, and a small child alone near water presents, in stark ecological terms, an opportunity. But investigators returned to the same problem every time the theory was examined. An animal encounter in that terrain and at that scale would almost certainly leave something behind. Evidence of a struggle in soft ground, biological trace material on the brush. And those 2 big boots, which would have come off easily, should have been somewhere if an animal had been involved. They were sitting back at camp, next to the blanket and the sippy cup and the toy monkey, which meant Dior had still been wearing them when he left the campsite. Whatever happened after that left nothing for any searcher to locate. Here's the critical detail about the geography that shapes everything else. 1 road in, 1 road out. A single access road connecting Timber Creek Campground to the larger network. Any vehicle departing after Dior disappeared would have been visible to anyone arriving or present. Investigators examined this carefully. No unknown vehicle was reported. No stranger had been observed at the campsite that afternoon. The 5 people who drove in were the 5 people documented at the site when the search began. The FBI was brought in to assist. Over the weeks and months that followed, cadaver dogs were returned to the site on multiple occasions. On at least one visit, a dog alerted on a specific location near the campsite. Forensic analysis of the material recovered from that location found no identifiable human DNA, a result that investigators acknowledged publicly but could not resolve. That kind of outcome, a trained alert without confirmable physical evidence, is in some ways more destabilizing than a clean, negative result. It gives investigators something to examine without giving them anywhere to go with it. Both parents were named persons of interest at various points in the years following Dior's disappearance, a designation their attorneys consistently challenged and disputed. Isaac Reinwand was also named a person of interest. In 2019, nearly 4 years after Dior disappeared, Reinwand gave a recorded interview to East Idaho News in which he made statements that law enforcement publicly described as concerning and inconsistent with his previous accounts. The specific content of those statements was never fully disclosed. No charges have ever been filed in connection with Dior Kunz Jr.'s disappearance. Not against Reinwand, not against either parent, not against anyone present at that campsite on July 10, 2015. Every summer since then, search teams have returned to the Timber Creek area. Professional searchers, experienced volunteers, people who spend their careers locating human remains in terrain far more remote and far less documented than this one campsite in Lemhi County. Every summer, the result is the same. Nothing. A decade of coordinated effort across ground that has been walked, ridden on horseback, flown over with infrared imaging, and worked by trained scent dogs. And not a single physical trace of a child who was present at this specific location on this specific afternoon, and then was not. What remains is the image of that campsite as the first deputies found it. A child's blanket folded where he left it. A sippy cup, a small toy monkey. 3 objects arranged with the careless certainty of someone who fully intends to return. One road out, sitting empty in the afternoon light. Timber Creek moving through the trees the way it always moves, the way it was moving before anyone arrived, and the way it kept moving long after the search helicopters went quiet, and the K-9 units were loaded back into their vehicles, and everyone drove home down that single road with no answers and no child. Dior Kunz Jr. is still listed as a missing person. He would be 12 years old now. And the next case didn't involve a toddler near the water. The next case involved a grown man, a professional, someone who had traveled internationally for his work and had been hired onto a serious film production, who ran. Full sprint, away from the crew he was working with, toward a cliff edge that should have stopped any rational person cold. And nobody who witnessed it that afternoon has been able to say with any certainty what he was running from. October 5th, 2018. Penman Mine, Ora Grande, Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, Idaho. Before we get into what happened that afternoon, you need to understand the scale of the place. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest covers roughly 4 million acres of northern Idaho, a number that reads cleanly on a page and means almost nothing until you're standing inside it. The terrain is not just remote in the sense of being far from a town. It is remote in the geological sense, the kind of landscape that was shaped by forces that don't particularly acknowledge human presence and hasn't softened much in the time since. Steep ridgelines that drop without warning into gorges that take serious climbing equipment to navigate safely. River drainages running fast and cold at the bottom of those gorges, fed by snowmelt that doesn't fully stop even in October. Wildlife corridors used by animals that don't back down easily from an encounter. And threading through all of it, the ruins of old mining operations, shafts and tailings and collapsed wooden structures that mark where men once came to pull something valuable out of the ground, and then, eventually, stopped coming. The Penman Mine in the Ora Grande area sits inside this landscape, in a part of the forest where the roads in are rough and the roads out require you to pay attention. It is not a tourist destination. It is not on the way to anywhere else. You go there because you specifically mean to go there, because you've planned for it, because you've accepted in advance what the terrain is going to ask of you. A British documentary film crew specifically meant to go there. Terrence Woods Jr. was 26 years old. Some reports list him as 27 at the time of his disappearance, and that age is noted in the public record as disputed by a year in either direction. So it's worth flagging that minor inconsistency clearly. He was Maryland-born, but London-based, having spent the previous 5 years building a career in United Kingdom television production. By the accounts of people who knew his work, he was talented and adaptable. The kind of professional who moved comfortably between technical roles and creative ones. Someone whose resume reflected work on high-profile British productions. He had traveled internationally for his work well before this trip. He was not a person for whom Idaho's backcountry would represent a first encounter with remote locations or physically demanding working conditions. He understood, in the practical way that location producers have to understand, what it meant to work somewhere that help was a long drive away. The project was a documentary about the Penman mines. The crew had traveled specifically to the Ora Grande area to film footage of the historic mining site, part of a larger piece exploring the remnants of Idaho's mining history in this particular corner of the Clearwater. Documentary work in locations like this requires a specific kind of logistical discipline. You plan for unreliable communication. You account for the distance to emergency services. You make sure every person on the crew understands the terrain variables before you start rolling. The crew had done that planning. They were on location, the equipment was running, and by all available accounts, the morning and early afternoon of October 5th looked like an ordinary working day in an extraordinary location. Here's the first thing that didn't fit. Sometime that morning, Terrence sent a text message to his father. The message told him that the return date had changed. He'd be coming back on the 10th now, rather than the date he'd originally given. His father later described the message as odd in a way that was difficult to immediately pin down. Not alarming on its surface. Scheduled changes on location shoots happen constantly, and a simple date adjustment is not a red flag in isolation. But the message offered no explanation for the change. No context about what had extended the shoot. No logistical detail about the production's needs, no tone that pointed in any clear direction. Not excitement, not frustration, not the ordinary fatigue of someone deep into a difficult shoot. Just the revised date and nothing else. It was the kind of message that sits in your inbox without incident until something goes wrong. And then you return to it and realize you cannot explain it at all. His father held on to it. It didn't leave him. By mid-afternoon, the crew was still working at the Penman mine site. This is where it stops being normal. Multiple crew members later reported that Terrence had begun behaving differently as the afternoon progressed. The specific descriptions varied somewhat across different accounts, but the core of what witnesses described was consistent. He was acting in a way that was out of character, in a way that didn't correspond to anything happening in the production or to any identifiable external trigger that the people around him could point to. At some point during the afternoon, he experienced what crew members described as a panic attack. A sudden and significant escalation of visible distress that the people around him registered as serious and unexpected. They were processing what they were seeing, trying to figure out how to respond, when Terrence did something that no one present has been able to adequately explain in the 6 years since it happened. A drone was being operated as part of the shoot. Terrence reached out and attempted to grab the drone out of the air with his bare hands while it was actively in flight. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it doesn't resolve into anything comfortable on examination. This was a professional production environment. Terrence was an experienced producer who understood how film equipment worked, what aerial filming protocols required, and what the practical consequences of interfering with an in-flight drone would be. Grabbing a flying drone with your bare hands is not a reflexive, impulsive gesture in the way that flinching or stepping toward something might be. It is a specific, directed physical action aimed at a piece of machinery that is actively moving through the air. The crew members who witnessed it described the moment as shocking. Nobody on that crew had seen him behave like this before. Nobody had any framework for it. He then said he needed to use the bathroom, stepped away from the group, and ran. Not walked, ran. At full speed, away from the crew, in the direction of a steep cliff face at the edge of the clearing. One of his colleagues, a producer on the project, later said that Terrence was running faster than he had ever seen anyone run. That description has stayed in the reporting on this case for 6 years because it resists every comfortable interpretation. Fear produces fast movement. Certain medical emergencies produce fast, disoriented movement. But the combination of the speed described and the direction, straight toward terrain that should function as an instinctive physical barrier to anyone in a rational state of mind, those two elements together produce a picture that doesn't flatten into any single explanation, no matter how many times you look at it. He dropped his two-way radio as he ran. It landed in the dirt behind him and stayed there. Here's the critical detail. Nobody was able to maintain visual contact with him. The speed and the terrain made it impossible within seconds. Crew members shouted his name. They moved toward the cliff face and the tree line beyond it. By the time anyone reached the area where he had disappeared from view, Terrence Woods Jr. was not there. No visible trail of disturbance through the brush at the cliff's edge. No indication of which direction he had continued into the forest on the other side. No sign of a fall. No sign of a stop. No sign that the terrain had slowed him at all. The thick timber absorbed him the way this part of the Clearwater absorbs everything, completely and without leaving a record. The two-way radio lay where he dropped it. Now this is where the case turns dark in a different way, because the response timeline matters here, and what happened next is a significant problem. The disappearance was reported to authorities at approximately 6:41 in the evening. There was still usable daylight remaining. The formal search, however, did not begin until the following morning. The decision was made, for reasons described as relating to the late hour and the logistical difficulty of the terrain, to wait until dawn before committing ground resources to the area. That decision meant that the entire critical window between Terrence dropping his radio and vanishing into the forest, the window when a trained search team might have located a trail, when scent evidence was at its freshest, when the physical record of his passage through the brush would have been most visible and least degraded. That entire window was allowed to close without a single searcher on the ground following his route. By the time teams deployed the next morning, a full night of wind, temperature drop, and animal movement had worked over whatever trail existed. Canine units were brought in and deployed throughout the area surrounding the Penman mine. Helicopter searches ran over the ridgelines and river drainages. Ground teams worked the terrain on foot across multiple days. The search was ultimately called off without a single piece of physical evidence recovered. No remains, no clothing, no equipment. Nothing that could be conclusively tied to Terrence's presence in the forest after he ran. Terrence's family has been outspoken in the years since his disappearance, and they have not accepted the official accounting of what happened that afternoon. His father has raised concerns publicly that extend beyond the delayed search response. The family has suggested, and it is important to be explicit, that this is an unconfirmed theory, not a finding supported by any criminal proceeding, that the dynamics within that film crew may not have been fully disclosed to investigators, and that foul play cannot be ruled out. Law enforcement has not publicly named any member of the crew as a suspect. No criminal charges have been filed. The family's concerns exist in the documented record as concerns, serious ones, from people with every reason to keep asking, but not as established fact. What the documented record does confirm is this: a young man in his mid-20s, experienced and well-traveled, ran at full speed toward a cliff face in one of the most remote sections of Idaho in the middle of a working afternoon, dropped his radio, and disappeared so completely that a multi-day coordinated search of the surrounding forest produced nothing at all. Whether what drove him to run was a sudden medical or psychological crisis, whether he encountered something in that environment that no one around him could see, whether the explanation lives somewhere in the interior of that production that has never been fully disclosed, all of it remains officially unknown. The Nez Perce Clearwater is 4 million acres, a dropped radio in the dirt, a cliff edge with thick timber beyond it, and no answer, 6 years later, about what Terrence Woods Jr. saw or felt or heard in the seconds before he ran. His family is still asking. The next case brings us out of the forest entirely, back into a quiet neighborhood, a summer evening, the kind of block where kids play outside until the light goes and parents watch from porches and nothing is supposed to go wrong. And for a 5-year-old named Michael, it went wrong in the space of a single minute. The evening of July 27th, 2021, Fruitland, Idaho. Fruitland sits in the far western edge of the state, just across the Snake River from Ontario, Oregon, in a part of Idaho that doesn't look the way most people picture Idaho when they close their eyes. No dramatic mountain ranges pressing in from all sides. No dense national forest swallowing the horizon. Fruitland is flat agricultural land. Irrigated fields, corn rows that run to the edge of residential streets, irrigation canals threading through the landscape the way veins thread through a hand. The Snake River runs along the town's western boundary, wide and brown and indifferent. And the fields between the river and the residential streets are the kind of fields that produce food quietly and in enormous quantity, and don't announce themselves to anyone who isn't already looking. A town of roughly 5,400 people. The kind of place where the same families have lived on the same streets for generations, and where a new face gets noticed because there aren't that many new faces. A quiet place. A safe-feeling place. The kind of neighborhood where a 5-year-old playing outside on a summer evening is not a risk calculation any parent thinks twice about making, because nothing here has ever suggested it needed to be. Michael Joseph Vaughn had just turned 5. His family called him Monkey, a nickname that fit him apparently the way all perfect nicknames fit. The ones that get attached early and never let go because they are simply more accurate than the name on the birth certificate. He was small and quick and happy in the way that 5-year-olds are happy, fully committed to whatever the current moment holds. Moving through the world with the total physical confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned that some places aren't safe. On the evening of July 27th, he was wearing a light blue Minecraft t-shirt, dark blue boxer briefs, and sandals. He was near his home, in a neighborhood he knew, on a summer evening that still had light left in it. Someone saw him. Then the light shifted slightly, the way it does in late July when the sun starts its long Idaho descent, and Michael wasn't there anymore. His mother's public statement in the days immediately following his disappearance captured it with a precision that made it harder to hear, not easier. 1 minute he's here, she said, and people see him, and the next he's gone. That's the entire geography of the disappearance. 1 minute. A known neighborhood, a child who was seen by people who knew him and then was not. No witnessed departure. No direction of travel. No moment that anyone present could later identify as the one where things changed, the way you usually can in retrospect. The door closing, the figure moving down the street, the last glance someone took before turning back to whatever they were doing. With Michael, there was no that moment available. He was present, and then the space where he had been was empty. And the evening continued for a few more seconds before someone understood what the emptiness meant. Here's the critical detail about what came next. The response was not small, and it was not slow. Within hours, Fruitland's police department had activated a search that would grow into one of the largest missing child operations in the history of Canyon County. Volunteers came in from across the Treasure Valley. Professional search teams deployed from multiple agencies. The agricultural landscape surrounding Fruitland's residential streets presented its own specific challenges. Cornfields in late July are at full height, tight rows of vegetation that a small child could move through in any direction and leave almost no readable trail, dense enough to muffle sound and limit sight lines to a matter of feet. A child in a light blue shirt could stand 20 feet inside a cornfield and be entirely invisible to someone standing at the row's edge. Law enforcement made the decision to have the surrounding cornfields harvested and cleared specifically to eliminate that variable. To remove the possibility that Michael was concealed somewhere inside the crop, conscious or otherwise. Hundreds of acres of corn came down ahead of their harvest schedule, so the teams could see the ground beneath. The irrigation canals and drainage systems running through and around the town were searched systematically, because water is always the first arithmetic you run when a young child goes missing in agricultural terrain near an active canal network. The area around Red Wing Street, close to Michael's home, received particular and sustained attention throughout the operation. Nothing, not a sandal, not a thread from a light blue Minecraft shirt, not a single physical trace of a 5-year-old in a residential neighborhood where hundreds of people were actively and systematically looking for him across cleared ground. That absence, total, clean, not even a false lead to chase, became its own form of answer over time, though not the kind of answer that gave anyone anything to hold on to. This is where it stops being a search and rescue story and becomes something else entirely. Fruitland's police chief made a public statement in the months following Michael's disappearance that was notable for its directness. Based on the investigation, he said, he believed Michael was deceased. That statement did not come from a vacuum. It came from the accumulated weight of what investigators had developed over dozens of search warrants, 27 formally executed, along with triple that number in consensual searches of properties, outbuildings, and vehicles in and around the Fruitland area. The investigation expanded outward from Michael's immediate neighborhood in concentric rings, pulling in more addresses, more interviews, more consensual access requests as the picture became clearer about where investigators believed the relevant geography of this case actually was. What those warrants and searches built, piece by piece, was an investigative picture that pointed not toward accident, not toward a child wandering off into agricultural terrain and meeting some environmental fate, but toward something that other people had done to Michael Vaughn and then worked actively to conceal. Investigators came to believe, and stated publicly, that Michael had been buried on Red Wing Street, and that his remains had subsequently been moved. The word subsequently is doing significant work in that sentence, because it implies not just a crime, but a second deliberate act to prevent the first crime from being discovered. Someone, investigators concluded, had known where Michael was and had made a decision to relocate whatever remained of him after the search intensified around that specific location. That is not the behavior of an accident. That is not the behavior of a situation that spiraled out of control in a way nobody planned for. That is premeditation applied twice, once in the act itself, and once in the response to the pressure of a community-wide search pressing closer to the truth. In 2022, a woman named Kayla Wandra was arrested in connection with Michael's case. The charge was failure to report a child's death, not the act itself, but the silence around it. The deliberate choice not to pick up a phone and tell someone what had happened to a 5-year-old boy. Investigators stated publicly that they believed 4 people in total had knowledge of what happened to Michael and had chosen not to come forward with that knowledge at any point during the search. Wandra's arrest was described as one step in an ongoing investigation rather than its resolution. In 2023, Idaho Governor Brad Little signed what became known as Monkey's Law, legislation strengthening the legal obligation to report a child's death, a direct legislative response to the specific failure that the Vaughn case had exposed in Idaho's existing statutes, a law named after a 5-year-old's nickname, built from the wreckage of what happened to him. As of the time this account is being written, no one has been charged with Michael's death. His remains have never been found. The case is still open. Now this is where the case turns dark in the way that lingers longest. A 5-year-old in a neighborhood he knew, on an evening with light still in the sky, seen by people who recognized him, and then not seen at all. Hundreds of acres of cleared farmland, 27 search warrants, and triple that in voluntary searches. A police chief willing to say out loud, in public, that he believes this child was killed and that people with knowledge of it are still living in the community. A burial site on a specific named street that was then, apparently, disturbed and relocated. Remains that have not been recovered despite years of effort and the full weight of a continuing criminal investigation. A law named after him that couldn't save him. His mother keeps looking. His family keeps asking. The flyer with Michael's face on it, the light blue Minecraft shirt, the sandals, the nickname Monkey printed underneath, has been on refrigerators and community boards across Canyon County for 3 years now. The way these flyers accumulate in the places where people refuse to stop looking even when the institutional search has moved into its long, quieter phase. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. There's a lot more ground left to cover. Canyon County is still holding this one. 4 people, investigators believe, know what happened on that summer evening. The cornfields are gone. The canal banks have been walked. Red Wing Street has been examined by people whose professional purpose is to find what other people try to hide. And Michael Joseph Vaughn, 5 years old, nicknamed Monkey, is still listed as a missing child, a legal category that does not fully contain what investigators believe happened to him, but is the only category that accurately reflects the fact that he has never been found. The image that stays is not the cleared fields or the canal banks in the summer heat. It's simpler and quieter than that. It's a flyer on a refrigerator with a 5-year-old's face on it, and the word Monkey underneath in bold letters, and a phone number that has been active for 3 years without producing the answer it was printed to find. The next boy was also young. He was 8 years old, and his name was Robert. He vanished from a Boise apartment complex in the middle of a July heat wave, and the search that followed brought 2,300 people through a dense urban neighborhood looking for a child described as having an impish grin, a kid who was supposed to be spending a normal overnight visit with his mother. What they found 10 days later was not what any of them had hoped to find. And when they found it, the case stopped being a missing child investigation and became something that had been visible in the details from nearly the beginning. If you knew where to look, and if the people who should have been looking had been looking in the right direction from the start. July 24th, 2009. Oak Village Apartment Complex, Boise, Idaho. Boise in late July is the kind of heat that doesn't apologize. The Treasure Valley sits in a high desert basin that collects summer temperature the way a bowl collects water. And by the third week of July, the afternoon highs are sitting reliably in the mid-90s, with a dry, pressing weight that makes the shade feel like a negotiation rather than a relief. The Oak Village apartment complex sits in the southeast part of the city, a dense residential cluster of the kind that exists in most mid-sized American cities. Parking lots, exterior staircases, ground floor units with small patios. The texture of a community where people are close together in the physical sense, without necessarily being close in any other sense. Children play outside in the common areas in the evenings when the direct sun has backed off enough to make it bearable. Families move through the shared spaces with the low-level familiarity of people who see each other regularly without necessarily knowing each other well. It is not an isolated location. It is not remote. There are other people nearby at essentially every hour, which makes what happened there on the evening of July 24th simultaneously more confusing and more devastating than if it had happened somewhere the landscape could absorb quietly. Robert Manuel was 8 years old. People who knew him described him with a consistency that feels like the kind of portrait that only emerges when a description is genuinely accurate rather than shaped by grief. An impish grin, they said, the kind of face that communicates mischief as a default setting even when the kid is doing nothing in particular. He was energetic and social, the kind of child who moved toward other people rather than away from them, who filled the ambient space of whatever room or yard or common area he occupied with a specific and recognizable energy. He liked being around people. He was, in the way of a lot of 8-year-olds with strong personalities, the kind of child whose presence in a space is immediately legible to everyone in that space. You knew when Robert was around, which meant, in the most painful possible application of that observation, that when he wasn't around anymore, that absence registered clearly too, or should have. He was at the Oak Village complex that night for an overnight visit with his mother. A routine arrangement, the kind that many families navigate without incident across thousands of ordinary nights. His mother, Amanda Jenkins, lived at the complex. Robert's primary residence was elsewhere, with his father. But overnight visits were a regular part of the existing arrangement. There was nothing on paper that distinguished July 24th from any other overnight visit Robert had made to that apartment. The heat was the same. The parking lot was the same. The exterior staircases in the common areas and the low ambient noise of a dense residential complex in a Boise summer were all exactly the same as they had been on every prior visit. At some point on the evening of July 24th, Robert Manuel was not at the apartment anymore. The initial report framed it as a missing child, the category that generates immediate response and broad mobilization, which is exactly what it should generate and exactly what happened. Within hours of the report, Boise police had activated a search that grew rapidly into one of the largest missing child operations the city had ever run. By the time the search reached its peak, roughly 2,300 people were involved. Volunteers from across the Treasure Valley and beyond, professional search teams, law enforcement from multiple agencies moving through the neighborhood surrounding Oak Village in a systematic, expanding pattern. The geography of the search was shaped by the terrain available to a child on foot from that apartment complex. Residential streets, green spaces, and the network of canals that run through and around the greater Boise area, carrying irrigation water south from the Boise River toward the agricultural land outside the city. The New York Canal System, one of the largest irrigation canal networks in the region, runs through the area south of the city toward the community of Kuna. And canal banks are always part of the calculus when a young child goes missing in the Treasure Valley. The water in those canals moves faster than it looks from the bank. It is cold even in July. Fed by snowmelt upstream, and the current does not pause for anything that enters it. Here's the critical detail that was visible almost from the beginning, though it took investigators time to assemble its full weight. The accounts being given by the adults at the Oak Village apartment were not holding together cleanly. A detective working the case in those first 36 hours made an observation later, one that became significant in the context of what followed. That by mid-morning of the day after Robert was reported missing, the timelines were already showing the kind of internal inconsistency that experienced investigators learned to read as a signal. The stories were not catastrophically contradictory in the obvious way of a lie being told badly and obviously. They were inconsistent in a subtler, more telling way. The edges didn't match. The sequence of events shifted slightly depending on who was recounting it and when. And the gaps in the account were located in the exact places where gaps would need to be if someone was deliberately leaving space around something they didn't want examined too closely. The internal logic of the timeline had soft spots in it, and those soft spots were not randomly distributed. By mid-morning of day 2, the detective knew there were real issues with the stories, and the timeline was getting weak fast. That knowledge existed inside the investigation, while 2,300 people were still walking the canal banks in the summer heat and calling Robert's name into the dry air of the Treasure Valley. On August 3, 2009, 10 days after Robert Manuel was reported missing, a body was pulled from a canal south of Boise. The physical description matched Robert's. The identification was confirmed. The location where his body was recovered was not near the Oak Village apartment complex. It was not even in the same part of the city. The distance between where Robert had last been seen and where he was found required explanation, required specifically an explanation for how a body moves from one location to another, because bodies do not move themselves, and canals do not reach into apartment complexes and pull children into the current. That distance was not an accident of geography. It was a decision. Someone had made it deliberately, carrying the weight of it in the Boise heat, and the canal had done the rest. Now this is where the case turns dark, in the way that doesn't let go. When Robert's body was recovered on August 3rd, the investigation formally changed categories. It stopped being a missing child case, a category that still carries, however grimly, the structural possibility of a living child somewhere out there, and became a homicide investigation. That transition is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a fundamental reorientation of every investigative resource, every interview approach, every piece of evidence already collected, and every piece still to be gathered. And it meant that the accounts being given by the adults at Oak Village, the accounts that had already been internally flagged as inconsistent and incomplete, were now being examined against a different and far more serious framework than a missing child timeline review. The investigation produced charges. Amanda Jenkins, Robert's mother, was charged and convicted in connection with his death. Her boyfriend, Darren Ehrlich, was also charged and convicted. The specific legal findings against each are part of the public court record, and both convictions stand. What the case record also confirms, and what became part of the public conversation around Robert's death in the years that followed, was the documented history of prior concerns about Robert's welfare that existed before July 24, 2009. That documented history, the reports that had been made, the interventions that had or hadn't happened, the specific gap between what was known about the situation inside that apartment and what was done about that knowledge, became part of the larger, harder conversation that communities are always eventually forced to have after a case like this one. The conversation about what systems exist to protect children, about where those systems have seams in them, about the distance between a concern being registered and a concern being acted upon with the urgency it deserved. Robert Manuel fell through a seam that had been visible before he disappeared, and the question of why that seam hadn't been closed in time became part of the public reckoning that followed the convictions. Robert Manuel was 8 years old. The physical detail that stays from this case, the one that makes the geography of it most legible and hardest to look at directly, is that distance. The distance between Oak Village and the canal where Robert was found. The distance that required a deliberate choice, a physical act of movement, a decision to put a child's body into the water of an irrigation system that carries its contents south through the Treasure Valley in the direction of Kuna and the dry farmland beyond the city limits. Investigators had walked those canal banks in the summer sun while 2,300 volunteers were still organized around the premise that Robert might be somewhere reachable and findable. Somewhere that turning a corner or answering a radio might resolve into something other than what the canal was already holding without announcement. The canal didn't announce itself. It just moved, quiet and continuous and brown in the July heat, carrying whatever was in it southward while the search continued in the wrong direction, and the detective sat with his inconsistent timeline and the soft spots in the accounts that told him, before the canal told anyone else, that this was not a story about a child who wandered away. Both convictions stand. The image that holds from this case is not the canal bank or the apartment complex or the 2,300 searchers moving through the heat. It is a detective on the morning of day 2, sitting with a timeline that doesn't line up at its edges, knowing that the gaps are exactly where they'd need to be if someone needed them to be there. Knowing all of that while the search was still configured as a rescue, while the canal was still moving south, while the Boise summer continued without acknowledgement of anything happening inside it. The next case is different from everything before it in this lineup, and it requires a clear geographical note before we go any further, because the disappearance itself did not happen in Idaho. It happened in Colorado, on a cold December night in 1984, in the driveway of a house in Greeley, where a 12-year-old girl named Jonelle was dropped off after a Christmas concert and simply ceased to be present in the world for 35 years. The Idaho connection runs through the man who was eventually convicted of her murder, a man with deep Idaho roots, a man who had run for governor of this state, a man whose obsessive and decades-long public interest in this case turned out to be something other than the civic concern he had always presented it as. The geography of a disappearance and the geography of its resolution are not always the same map. This case is the clearest proof of that. December 20th, 1984. Greeley, Colorado. Before anything else, the geographical note that this case requires. What follows is a Colorado disappearance. Jonelle Matthews vanished from her family's home in Greeley, Colorado, and her remains were found in Weld County, Colorado, 35 years later. The Idaho connection in this case runs specifically through the man who was convicted of her murder. A man with documented Idaho roots who ran for governor of this state in 2014 and whose involvement with this case became the through line of one of the longest cold case resolutions in American criminal history. That connection is real, documented, and significant. But the disappearance itself was a Colorado event, and that needs to be stated plainly before we go any further, because the geography matters and because accuracy about these cases is the only thing that makes them worth telling. Jonelle Ann Matthews was 12 years old. She was a choir singer, theatrical in the way that some children are theatrical from birth. Loud in the best possible sense. Funny. The kind of person who functions as the center of any room she walks into, not because she demands it, but because her energy naturally organizes the space around her. People who knew her as a child described her with the kind of specific, laughing fondness that tells you she was genuinely memorable, not just beloved in the retrospective way that tragedy manufactures. She sang in her school choir. She performed. She was a child who participated fully and enthusiastically in the social life of her school and her neighborhood, the kind of kid whose absence from any gathering would be immediately and specifically felt. Not a quiet absence, not the kind that takes a few minutes to register, but the immediate kind, the kind where the room knows right away that something is missing. She was, by every account available, a child who was fully and completely herself in a way that made her presence very legible to everyone around her, and made her absence, when it came, something that could not be rationalized or absorbed quietly. The evening of December 20th was a Thursday. Jonelle had performed in a Christmas concert that evening, the kind of school event that fills a gymnasium with parents and grandparents and younger siblings, everybody in their good clothes, the lights up warm against the cold outside, and the air smelling of wool coats and whatever the school cafeteria had been cooking earlier in the day. After the concert, she was given a ride home by a family friend. The drive was short. The house on 28th Street in Greeley was her house, her neighborhood, a place she had been dropped off at dozens of times across the ordinary course of a 12-year-old's life. The family friend pulled up to the house. Jonelle got out of the car, and the car drove away. The evening was cold in the way that northeastern Colorado is cold in late December, the kind of cold that settles into the ground and stays there, that makes the snow on the grass hard and crusted at the surface, that preserves the impressions of footsteps clearly and for a long time. That last detail will matter. That moment, Jonelle stepping out of the car pulling away, the front door of her house ahead of her, was the last confirmed time anyone saw Jonelle Matthews alive. When her family returned home between 8 and 8:30 that evening, the house was empty. Not empty in the way of a house whose occupant has stepped out briefly and will be back in a moment. Empty in the way that registers wrong immediately, the way that makes you move through the rooms quickly and then stand still and feel the absence as a physical weight pressing against the inside of your chest. Jonelle was not in her bedroom. She was not in any other room. She was not in the yard. She had been dropped at the door of her own home on a cold December evening after a Christmas concert, and had, in the space of whatever time elapsed between the car pulling away and her family's return, simply stopped being there. The house held no evidence of a struggle, no note, no indication of a rushed departure that Jonelle had chosen for herself. Just the quiet interior of a family home on a December evening with a child-sized absence at the center of it. Here's the critical detail that investigators held back for decades. In the snow around the house that night, there were footprints. Specifically, there were footprints that appeared to have been deliberately obscured, raked over, smoothed out, tampered with in a way that suggested someone had made a careful and purposeful effort to remove the physical evidence of their own presence from the snow around the Matthews home on the night Jonelle disappeared. This was not a natural weathering of tracks. This was an intentional act, performed by someone who understood that footprints in hard-crusted December snow were evidence, and who took the time on that cold Thursday evening to address that evidence before leaving. This detail was not released publicly. It was held inside the investigation as the kind of specific, withheld information that investigators preserve precisely because it can, in some future interview or confession or statement, separate someone with genuine knowledge of what happened from someone constructing a plausible story around what was publicly available. The raked footprints in the snow stayed locked inside the case file for 35 years while Jonelle's face went up on milk cartons and her name moved through the National Missing Child clearinghouses, and her family continued living in the specific, unresolvable grief of not knowing where their daughter was or what had happened to her. Jonelle Matthews became, in the years following her disappearance, one of the most recognizable faces of the milk carton era. The period in the mid to late 1980s when missing children's photographs appeared on the side of dairy cartons in grocery stores across the country, a response to the wave of high-profile child disappearances that had shaken American communities in that decade. Her face was one of the ones people saw at breakfast tables, in office kitchens, at the checkout line in the dairy aisle. The case never went fully cold in the institutional sense. Investigators returned to it periodically, worked new leads as they surfaced, tracked the developments in forensic science and DNA technology that were gradually changing what cold case investigations could accomplish with evidence that had been sitting untouched for years. But for 35 years, no definitive answer came. No remains were found. No suspect was charged. The case remained open in the way that the worst cold cases remain open. Not inactive, not forgotten, but suspended in a state of unresolvable incompletion that becomes its own kind of inheritance for the family carrying it forward into each new year. This is where it stops being a cold case and becomes something else entirely. In July of 2019, oil field workers conducting routine operations in a rural area of Weld County, Colorado, came across human remains. The location was not near any trail, not near any public access point, not the kind of place anyone would find by accident or by searching along any logical or obvious route. The remains were in a location that required specific knowledge to find. Knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of the surrounding land, knowledge that could only come from someone who had been there with a purpose and a reason to leave something behind and not return to it. Forensic analysis of the remains confirmed their identity through DNA comparison. After 35 years, Jonelle Matthews had been found in a Weld County field, and the investigation that her discovery reopened was the one that had been running, quietly and with increasing technological sophistication, since a cold December Thursday in 1984. The discovery reopened everything. Now this is where the Idaho connection enters the case, and it enters it with the particular weight of someone who had been, for years, publicly and conspicuously interested in Jonelle's disappearance, in a way that had always been noted, but never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. Steve Pankey was a man with documented ties to Idaho. He had lived in the state, embedded himself in its political community, and run as a candidate for governor of Idaho in 2014, a campaign that gave him a measure of public profile and institutional access that a private citizen wouldn't have had. He had also, over the course of many years and across multiple states and legal contexts, made statements about the Jonelle Matthews case that were notable for their frequency, their specificity, and their persistence across decades. He had contacted investigators. He had offered theories. He had written about the case and spoken about it publicly in ways that people who followed it closely had noticed without being able to categorize cleanly as anything other than unusual. In the years before Jonelle's remains were discovered in 2019, Pankey had been examined by investigators on multiple occasions without that examination producing a charge. After the discovery, that changed. In 2022, Steve Pankey was convicted in a Colorado court of felony murder, second-degree kidnapping, and false reporting in connection with Jonelle Matthews' death. The conviction followed a trial in which the decades of statements Pankey had made about the case were presented as part of the evidentiary record. Statements that reflected specific knowledge of details that had never been made public, including details that aligned with the raked footprints in the snow that investigators had kept sealed inside the case file for 35 years. The jury convicted him. Steve Pankey, a man who had run for governor of Idaho, was found guilty of the murder of a 12-year-old girl who had been dropped at her front door after a Christmas choir concert in 1984 and had not been seen again until oil workers found her in a field in Weld County in the summer of 2019. He has maintained his innocence. His conviction is under appeal as of the time this account is being written, and that fact should be stated clearly and without hedging. What is not in dispute is the jury's finding. A finding reached after the full presentation of evidence at trial by 12 people who heard all of it and returned their verdict. Hit subscribe if cases like this one keep pulling you back. There's a lot more ground left to cover, and the next ones don't get easier. The detail that stays from this case is not the trial or the conviction or the decades of public statements made about a case Pankey claimed to follow out of civic interest. It's the footprints. The raked, smoothed, deliberately obscured footprints in the hard December snow around the Matthews home. On the night of December 20th, 1984. Footprints that someone made and then immediately worked to erase, standing in the cold outside a family's house on a Thursday evening after a Christmas concert, taking the time to remove the physical record of their own presence before walking away. And then the snow came back every winter for 35 years and covered the ground where those footprints had been. And the case stayed open, and the family kept carrying it forward into each new year. And the raked footprints stayed sealed in a case file that no one who didn't need to know about them was ever told about. Until a July afternoon in 2019 produced remains, and 2022 produced a verdict. And the thing that had been held inside that snow for 35 years finally had a name attached to it. Jonelle Matthews was 12 years old. She was funny and loud and theatrical, and the center of every room she walked into. She sang in her school choir. She was dropped at her front door on a cold December evening and went inside a house that her family came home to find empty. Her face was on millions of milk cartons across this country for years. Her family waited 35 years for an answer about where she was. They found her in a field in Weld County. Back in Idaho, the mountains keep their own in a different way. Not in fields, not in canals, not in neighborhoods where other people were present and should have noticed something. In the back country, the mountains keep people through sheer geography, the distance, the terrain, the silence that settles over a wilderness corridor. When the last searcher has gone home and the case has moved from active to cold, and the file sits in a cabinet somewhere waiting for something the forest isn't going to volunteer. The next case lives entirely in that category. A man named Kyle Tolley, a mountain highway corridor in Boise County, a date in August 2001, and a set of answers that the terrain around Lohman has declined for more than 2 decades now to produce. August 17th, 2001. Lohman area, Boise County, Idaho. There is a particular kind of cold case file that investigators and researchers who work with missing person clearinghouses learn to recognize on sight. Not by its thickness, because these files are often thin, but by a specific quality of incompletion that runs through everything in them. The name is there. The date is there. The jurisdiction is documented. And then, where the rest of the file should be. The scene details, the last known location, the physical description of what was left behind. The witness accounts that sketch in the shape of what happened in the hours before the person stopped being findable. There is a particular kind of silence that is different from the silence of a case that has simply gone cold over time. It is the silence of a case that was sparse from the beginning. That doesn't mean it wasn't investigated. That doesn't mean the person wasn't real, wasn't missed, didn't matter to the people in his life who were left behind when he stopped being findable. It means that the circumstances that produced the disappearance also, through some combination of terrain and timing, and the specific vulnerabilities of a remote location in an era before comprehensive digital documentation, produced a record with gaps in it that cannot be responsibly filled in by anyone who wasn't there. Kyle Tolley's case lives in that category. And the responsible way to tell it is to tell it exactly as the record holds it, with its gaps named clearly its unknowns stated as unknowns, and its verified spine presented without embellishment or invention. What the record confirms. Kyle Tolley was reported missing on or around August 17, 2001, in the Lemhi area of Boise County, Idaho. His case is listed with the Boise County Sheriff's Office and appears in the long-term missing persons records maintained by Idaho law enforcement clearinghouses. It has remained open in those listings for more than 2 decades. The specific details of his personal background, his age at the time of his disappearance, the particulars of his physical description beyond what appears in the official listing, the circumstances of his life in the period leading up to the date he was reported missing, are not available in the publicly accessible record with the level of verification that would allow them to be stated here with confidence. So they won't be stated here. What matters is not filling the space with plausible-sounding detail that approximates a story. What matters is the verified outline and the terrain that surrounds that outline. And what both of those things together tell us about why Kyle Tolley's name is still sitting on an open case listing 23 years after he was reported missing in the mountains east of Boise. The Lemhi area sits in Boise County along the Highway 21 corridor, a road that Idahoans who travel it regularly know as the Ponderosa Pine Scenic Byway, which is a name that captures the beauty of the route accurately, and its remoteness only partially. Highway 21 runs northeast from Boise through the mountains toward Stanley, climbing steadily through the Boise National Forest along a route that follows the South Fork of the Payette River through a series of canyons before opening into broader mountain terrain as the elevation increases. The town of Lemhi itself sits at roughly 4,000 feet in elevation, a small community planted in a mountain valley where the river runs close enough to the road that you can hear it from the shoulder, and where the surrounding ridgelines rise steep and immediate enough that the light in the narrow canyon sections is reduced even at midday in midsummer. The forest here is the kind that absorbs distance. Dense ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, giving way at higher elevations to subalpine terrain where the trails become less maintained, the creek crossings less predictable, and the cell signal, which is unreliable along most of the Highway 21 corridor even now with modern infrastructure, disappears entirely into the rock and timber. Here's what that geography means in practical terms for a missing person investigation. A person who leaves the road on foot anywhere along the Highway 21 corridor near Lemhi enters terrain where the fundamental rules of search and rescue change almost immediately upon departure from the pavement. The river drainages that run off the main canyon walls are deep and steep-sided, choked with vegetation at the lower elevations and transitioning to rocky, exposed ground as the elevation climbs. A person moving through that terrain in summer would leave sign. Broken vegetation, disturbed ground near creek crossings. The kind of physical record that a train tracker can follow under good conditions and with enough time before the environment reasserts itself. But good conditions in the Boise National Forest require good weather, rapid deployment of search resources, and enough witness information to establish a clear last seen point and a probable direction of travel from it. When any of those elements is absent, when the report is delayed, or the last seen point is uncertain, or the weather has had time to work over the terrain before the first searcher arrives, the physical record of a person's passage through this kind of landscape degrades faster than in almost any other environment in Idaho. Rain accelerates it substantially. Wind accelerates it. The animal traffic that moves continuously through these drainages accelerates it further. And August in the Boise National Forest, despite being midsummer, is a month that produces afternoon thunderstorms with enough regularity and intensity that any trail older than 24 hours is potentially compromised in ways that make it difficult to distinguish genuine evidence from the background noise of weather and wildlife. The specific details of what Kyle Tolley left behind whether a vehicle was found at a trailhead or a roadside pullout along the highway, whether personal belongings were recovered at any location, whether there was a documented last known point of departure that could anchor the subsequent search geometry, are not available in the public record with sufficient verification to state here. These are the gaps that exist in this case file, and that cannot be responsibly bridged by inference or reconstruction. What can be said is that the absence of those details in the public record after more than 2 decades is itself a meaningful data point, because cases where early scene evidence is strong and well documented tend to produce public records that reflect that strength over time, even when the underlying case ultimately goes cold. Investigators write about what they found. Reporters write about what investigators say they found. The public record accumulates around strong early evidence, the way sediment accumulates around a solid object. The thinness of the available public record on Kyle Tolley's disappearance is consistent with a case where the early evidence picture was itself limited. For whatever combination of reasons that may reflect the timing of the initial report, the access challenges specific to this section of mountainous terrain, and the sparse witness base along a remote highway corridor where traffic is seasonal, often solitary, and not configured for the close observation of other travelers. This is where it stops being a record problem and becomes a terrain problem in the most fundamental sense. The Highway 21 corridor between Boise and Stanley passes through hundreds of square miles of national forest, where the official trail system is extensive, but the unofficial access points, the pullouts, the informal trailheads, the places where people park a vehicle and walk into the forest without telling anyone where they're going or when they plan to return, are more numerous still, and are used constantly by people whose relationship with this landscape is defined precisely by the expectation of solitude and self-sufficiency. This is not a corridor where unusual behavior at a trailhead draws attention, because the baseline of the corridor is people arriving alone, parking, and walking into the forest without detailed public announcement of their plans. The community of people who use Highway 21 regularly, hunters, fishermen, hikers moving between trailheads, people who simply drive it for the particular quality of the experience it offers, are accustomed to the fundamental solitude of the route. They expect other people on the road to be there for their own reasons, to manage their own affairs, to come back out when they intend to come back out. It is a corridor that is, by its deepest character, not designed for the early detection of a problem. Problems on Highway 21 announce themselves slowly, through absence rather than incident, through the accumulation of missed check-ins and unreturned calls, rather than through any visible moment of crisis on the road itself. By the time a problem is detectable from outside, the terrain has typically had hours, sometimes days, to work over whatever evidence existed. Boise County Sheriff's Office has maintained Kyle Tolley's listing as an open case for more than 2 decades. The specific investigative steps taken in that time, the searches conducted, the leads developed and exhausted, the forensic work, if any, was applied to the case in later years as cold case technology improved, are not available in detail in the public record. That is another gap the record holds without resolving, and it sits alongside all the others. The last scene detail, the scene specifics, the physical description, the personal history. What the listing itself confirms, stripped of everything the record doesn't provide, is that no resolution has been reached. No remains have been recovered and formally identified. No explanation has been established for what happened in the Lohman area on or around August 17, 2001, that caused Kyle Tolley to stop being findable. His name sits in the Idaho Clearinghouse records alongside dozens of other long-term missing persons cases. Cases that stretch back across decades, representing a category of unresolved human absence that this state's geography and the particular character of its backcountry terrain have produced with a consistency that no improvement in search capability has fully interrupted. Now this is where the case sits, which is to say, exactly where it has been sitting for 23 years, without movement and without resolution. An open listing. A remote mountain highway corridor that presents one of the most demanding search environments in Idaho. A date in August 2001, and a name, and a jurisdiction. And the particular silence that settles over a record that was sparse from the beginning and has not grown substantially denser in the years since. That silence is not nothing. It is, in some ways, the most honest representation of what this terrain does to the people it doesn't return. It reduces them to exactly what the record holds, which is a name and a date and an open status. And the question of what happened in the space between those fixed points is absorbed into the forest the way the forest absorbs everything it takes in, completely and without remainder and without announcement. The image from this case is quiet and specific. A mountain pullout at dusk along Highway 21. The light going amber and flat off the canyon walls. The south fork of the Payette moving in the shadow of the ridgeline below the road. The highway continuing northeast toward Stanley, emptying out in the gathering dark. With the ponderosa pine pressing in close from both sides and the evening thunderclouds already building over the high ridgeline the way they build every August afternoon in the Boise National Forest. Reliably and without warning and without concern for anything happening on the road beneath them. The next disappearances weren't isolated events in a single remote location. They followed a corridor, a specific stretch of northern Idaho highway that investigators have believed for decades was the hunting ground of a single offender who took at least 5 people from the area between 1979 and 1982 and has never been identified or charged. The corridor runs between small towns in the agricultural and forested country southwest of Moscow, Idaho. Close enough to a university community that students traveled it regularly. Rural enough that the people who moved through it alone were genuinely and completely alone in every sense that mattered. The youngest victim was 12 years old. Her name was Christina. And 50 years later, the highway between Genesee and Moscow is still holding whatever it knows about the people who traveled it and didn't come back. 1979. Sutton, Washington. The Lewis-Clark Valley Corridor, Idaho-Washington border region. Before the geography of this case can make sense, it needs to be placed correctly on the map, because the map is where this story lives and where it has always been most legible. The Lewis-Clark Valley sits at the confluence of the Snake and Clearwater rivers, straddling the Idaho-Washington border in a way that makes jurisdictional lines feel almost arbitrary against the physical reality of the landscape. Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington face each other across the Snake River, connected by bridges and by the shared character of a regional community that doesn't particularly organize itself around the state line running through the middle of it. South of Lewiston, the highway corridor runs through Sutton, Washington, tracing the Snake River south along its eastern bank. North and east of Lewiston, Highway 95 extends through the agricultural country of the Palouse. Rolling hills under wheat and barley and lentils, the terrain opening wide after the canyon country of the lower Snake and Clearwater. The towns spaced far enough apart that the road between them is genuinely rural and genuinely solitary in a way that the proximity to a university city doesn't fully mitigate. Moscow, Idaho sits at the northern end of this corridor, a college town of moderate size, home to the University of Idaho, that functions as a regional hub for a wide swath of the Palouse. Genesee sits between Moscow and Lewiston, small enough that it registers on the highway primarily as a grain elevator and a turnoff rather than as a destination. The road between these places is the kind of road that moves a lot of people in relative anonymity. Students agricultural workers, people commuting between the valley floor and the Palouse country above it. Through terrain where being observed by other travelers is not guaranteed, and where a person traveling alone is genuinely, practically alone. For more than 50 years, a pattern of disappearances and deaths in this corridor has remained without definitive resolution. Christina Lee White was 12 years old when she disappeared from Asotin, Washington in 1979. Asotin is a small community south of Clarkston on the Washington side of the Snake River, the kind of town that exists in close proximity to the larger regional hub of Lewiston-Clarkston without being absorbed into it. A separate community with its own character, small enough that most people know most other people by sight, if not by name. Christina was a child in that community, in a place where a 12-year-old should be known and visible and relatively safe in the way that small communities generate a baseline assumption of safety. She went missing in 1979 and has not been seen since. The specific circumstances of her disappearance, the exact location, the time, the details of what was last confirmed about her whereabouts, are drawn from the documented public record of her case, which has been maintained in the missing person listings that cover the Lewis-Clark Valley region across the decades since her disappearance. She is the anchoring case in a pattern that investigators have examined with increasing seriousness over the years, a pattern that extends across both sides of the Idaho-Washington border and across a span of years that suggests, to the investigators who have studied it most carefully, a single offender operating along this corridor during a defined period. Here's the critical detail about what makes this corridor case different from a single isolated disappearance. Investigators and researchers examining missing person cases and homicides in the Lewis-Clark Valley region have identified what they believe to be a cluster of at least 5 victims whose cases share characteristics consistent with a single offender operating in the area between 1979 and 1982. The victims were taken from or last seen in locations along and near the highway corridor connecting the Asotin area, the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley, and the Highway 95 route running north toward Moscow and Genesee. Their cases share elements of geography, proximity to this specific corridor, and elements of timing, concentrated in a roughly 3-year window, during which the frequency of disappearances and deaths in this relatively small regional area exceeded what random chance and unconnected individual circumstances would statistically produce. The specific victims associated with this pattern are documented in public reporting and in the work of investigators and journalists who have examined the Lewis-Clark Valley cases over the years. And Christina Lee White's 1979 disappearance from Asotin is consistently identified as one of the earliest cases connected to the pattern. This is where it stops being a regional history and becomes something that generates a specific, sustained dread. The geographic heart of this corridor case is a stretch of highway that passes through or near communities: Asotin, Clarkston, Lewiston, Genesee, Moscow, that are not isolated in the way that truly remote Idaho backcountry is isolated. These are places with populations, with institutions, with the social infrastructure of communities that function continuously and have people moving through them at all hours. The University of Idaho in Moscow means that the northern end of this corridor is, during the academic year, populated with young people who move between the campus and the surrounding region with the particular freedom of college students. Hitchhiking when it was common, traveling alone at night along roads they assumed were safe because the surrounding community felt familiar and inhabited. The agricultural character of the Palouse country between Genesee and Moscow means that the road itself is a working road, used continuously by people with practical reasons to be on it, none of whom would register as unusual to anyone observing the traffic. A predator operating on this corridor would have, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, an effectively unlimited supply of people moving through a landscape where the density of human presence was high enough to provide opportunity and low enough to ensure that individual travelers were genuinely alone for significant stretches of their journeys. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that the geography makes almost inescapable. The cross-jurisdictional character of the Lewis-Clark Valley has been identified consistently as one of the structural factors that complicated the early investigation of the pattern. Cases originating on the Washington side of the border, in Asotin County, in the Clarkston area, fell under Washington state jurisdiction. Cases originating on the Idaho side fell under Idaho jurisdiction, which itself was subdivided between Nez Perce County in the valley and Latah County to the north around Moscow. A pattern that crosses those lines is, in the practical reality of law enforcement in the 1970s and early 1980s, a pattern that no single agency is positioned to recognize and respond to as a unified phenomenon. Individual agencies see their own cases. The connections between cases in different jurisdictions require the kind of active, cross-agency communication and information sharing that was structurally harder to accomplish in that era than it is today. And that was dependent on investigators in different agencies independently arriving at the same recognition that their cases were related, and then choosing to act on that recognition collaboratively. That process takes time. During the time it takes, a pattern continues. The single offender theory. The conclusion that one person was responsible for some or all of the disappearances and deaths in this corridor between 1979 and 1982 has been discussed publicly by investigators and journalists who have examined the Lewis-Clark Valley cases across the decades. It is important to be explicit that this theory, however seriously it has been examined and however much investigative weight it has accumulated over the years, remains an unconfirmed theory. No suspect has been identified publicly. No arrest has been made in connection with the Lewis-Clark Valley corridor cases as a unified pattern. Individual cases within the cluster have their own investigative statuses, and those statuses vary. Christina Lee White's disappearance from Asotin in 1979 remains an open missing person case, the pattern of which her case is believed to be a part remains, officially and in the investigative record, unresolved. Which means that whoever operated along this corridor in those years, if the single offender theory is correct, has never been held accountable for any of it. Here's the detail that makes this case most difficult to set down and walk away from. Moscow, Idaho is a college town. It has been a college town continuously since the University of Idaho was established there in the late 19th century, and it continues to be one now. The Highway 95 corridor that connects Moscow to the Lewis-Clark Valley below, it is the same highway it was in 1979. The same road, connecting the same communities, used by successive generations of students and agricultural workers and regional commuters who move through the Palouse country between the valley floor and the plateau above it, without giving the road itself particular thought, because it is simply the road, the way most roads are simply the road to the people who use them daily. The possibility that someone who took at least 5 people from this corridor between 1979 and 1982 lived in or near the communities served by that road, lived perhaps within sight of the university where successive generations of students have arrived each fall and departed each spring across the intervening decades, is not a comfortable possibility to sit with. It has never been disproven because the person has never been identified. The absence of an arrest is not an absence of the person. It is simply an absence of the closure that identification and prosecution would provide. The families of the victims in this corridor have waited across different lengths of time and with varying access to investigative information about their specific cases. Christina Lee White's family has been waiting since 1979. 45 years at this point. Since a 12-year-old girl disappeared from a small community on the Snake River and the highway corridor that runs north from that community kept whatever it knows about her disappearance sealed inside a cold case file that has not produced a resolution in the decades since. The other families in this cluster have been waiting across their own specific and terrible intervals. None of them have received the answer that the pattern's resolution would require: an identification, an arrest, a trial, a verdict, because the pattern has not been resolved. The corridor keeps its knowledge the way the Highway 21 backcountry keeps its knowledge, not through any active or intentional concealment, but simply through the passage of time and the accumulation of years over a record that the original event deposited and nothing subsequent has fully illuminated. The image from this case is a highway sign between two small Palouse towns, the kind of green metal sign that tells you the distance to the next community in miles, mounted on a post at the roadside in the flat agricultural country between the valley and Moscow, reflecting headlights at night with the particular flat brightness of highway signage that has been there long enough to be invisible to the people who pass it every day. Behind the sign, wheat fields running to the horizon. Ahead, the road continuing north through terrain that in 1979 and 1980 and 1981 and 1982 was moving people through it the way it always moves people through it, continuously, anonymously, without record of passage or guarantee of return. No suspect, no resolution, 50 years and counting. The next man walked into the woods on an ordinary day in 1982 in a different part of Idaho entirely, in the mountain country around Grangeville in Idaho County. And the woods around Grangeville kept him with the same completeness and the same silence that this corridor has kept what it knows about the 5 people who traveled it and didn't come back. His name was Richard Barnett. The record on his case is thin, for the same reasons that the Kyle Tolley record is thin. Sparse from the beginning, cold almost immediately, and held now in the long-term missing person listings that Idaho maintains for cases that have not resolved across decades. And like Tolley's case, the responsible way to tell it is to tell it exactly as the record holds it. Without invention, without inference dressed as fact, without the false comfort of a plausible-sounding reconstruction built on gaps that cannot be honestly filled. August 31st, 1982. Grangeville, Idaho County, Idaho. Idaho County is the largest county in Idaho by land area, and it is worth pausing on what that means in concrete terms before anything else. Because the geography here is not incidental to the story. It is the story, in the way that geography is always the story in cases where a person enters a landscape and does not come back out. Idaho County covers roughly 8,500 square miles of terrain that encompasses some of the most rugged and least traveled backcountry in the continental United States. The Salmon River Mountains run through it. The Gospel Hump Wilderness sits inside its boundaries. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states, presses against its southern and eastern edges with a scale that makes the human settlements scattered through the county feel not just small, but genuinely provisional. The kind of communities that exist at the tolerance of the surrounding landscape rather than in any kind of negotiated balance with it. Grangeville itself sits in the Kama Prairie, a high agricultural plateau in the northern part of the county at an elevation of roughly 3,500 feet, surrounded on multiple sides by mountain terrain that rises sharply from the prairie edges and transitions quickly from farmland to forest to wilderness in the space of a few miles of road. It is a county seat, the administrative center of Idaho's largest county, a community of a few thousand people embedded in a landscape that dwarfs it completely in every direction. The forest begins at the edge of a town, in the way that the forest begins at the edge of all the communities in this part of Idaho. Not gradually, not with a long transitional zone of suburban development and managed recreation areas, but immediately, with the particular abruptness of a terrain that has not been substantially modified by human presence and does not particularly invite modification. Richard Barnett was reported missing on August 31st, 1982. His case is listed with the Idaho County Sheriff's Office and appears in the long-term missing person records maintained by Idaho law enforcement clearinghouses. It has been an open listing for more than 4 decades. The specific details of his personal background, his age at the time of his disappearance, the particulars of his life in the period leading up to August 1982, the details of what he was doing in the Grangeville area and what his connection to that community was, are not available in the publicly accessible record with the level of verification that would allow them to be stated here with confidence. The same discipline that shaped the telling of Kyle Tolley's case applies here, and it applies for the same reasons. These are cases where the public record is genuinely thin, not cases where the record is rich and simply inaccessible. Stating that distinction clearly is the only honest thing to do with it. So Richard Barnett's case will be told as the record holds it, with its verified spine, its confirmed gaps, and the terrain that surrounds both of those things given the weight that terrain deserves in a case where it is likely the primary factor in the absence of resolution. Here's what the geography of Idaho County does to a missing person investigation, stated in the most practical terms available. August in Idaho County is late summer in the mountain sense. The days are still long and warm, the trails are at their most accessible. The rivers are running lower and clearer than they were in the snowmelt months. And the backcountry that was difficult to access in May and June is now, relatively speaking, open. Hunters are beginning to move into the high country ahead of the early seasons. Hikers and fishermen are working the drainages. The roads into the wilderness areas are carrying more traffic than they will in 2 months. When the first serious snow closes the high passes and the backcountry becomes effectively sealed until spring. In this sense, late August is a moment of relative accessibility in Idaho County. The window when the landscape is most traversable and the human presence in it most distributed. And yet, even in this window of relative accessibility, the sheer scale of the available terrain means that a person who departs from a known location and moves into the surrounding country without a documented destination and without a clear timeline for their return can cover enough ground in a short period of time to make their subsequent location genuinely difficult to establish. The Gospel Hump Wilderness alone covers more than 200,000 acres of terrain, where GPS coverage was non-existent in 1982. And where even now, 4 decades later, the density of documented trails relative to the total land area means that a significant portion of the wilderness is crossed only by people who know it well enough to navigate without marked routes. This is where it stops being an abstract geography problem and becomes a specific investigative one. In 1982, the tools available to a search and rescue operation in Idaho County were the tools of that era, experienced searchers on foot, horseback, and in aircraft, working with topographic maps and radio communication and the local knowledge that residents of communities adjacent to wilderness areas accumulate over years of living next to terrain. They know in the specific, practical way that proximity teaches. Those tools were not trivial. Idaho County's search and rescue resources in the early 1980s were staffed by people who understood this landscape with a depth that no external resource could easily replicate. And the searches conducted in that era for missing persons in this terrain were serious operations mounted by serious people with genuine expertise. The limitation was not expertise or commitment. The limitation was the terrain itself, and the fundamental mathematical reality that 8,500 square miles of Idaho County contains more potential search area than any operation of finite resources can comprehensively cover, particularly when the last known location is uncertain and the direction of travel is unknown. In Richard Barnett's case, what those specific limitations produced, the last known location, the direction of travel, the initial search geometry, is not available in the public record in sufficient detail to reconstruct. The gaps in the record begin at exactly the point where those details would appear, and they do not close. Now this is where the case connects to something larger, and the connection is worth making carefully. Idaho County shares its territory with the same general region that appears in Case 2 of this account. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, sections of which extend into or border the northern parts of Idaho County. The Oro Grande area where Terrence Woods Jr. disappeared in October 2018 is part of the same broad mountain country that surrounds Grangeville to the north and east. The geographical echo between these two cases, separated by 36 years, involving two completely different people in two completely different sets of circumstances, is not an investigative connection. There is no documented link between what happened to Terrence Woods Jr. in October 2018 and what happened to Richard Barnett in August 1982. The connection is purely geographical, and it is worth stating as exactly that. This part of Idaho, this mountainous country of the Clearwater and the Gospel Hump and the Salmon River ranges, has a documented history of producing disappearances that the terrain does not subsequently resolve. That is not a pattern in the criminal sense. It is a pattern in the geographical sense. A recognition that certain landscapes, by virtue of their scale and their character and the specific ways they absorb and retain whatever enters them, produce a higher proportion of permanent human absence than other landscapes. Idaho County and the surrounding mountain country is one of those landscapes. The cases that emerge from it share a geographic logic that has nothing to do with any single cause and everything to do with what the terrain does to the physical record of human presence over time. Here's the critical detail about what 40-plus years does to a case like Richard Barnett's. Cold cases age in ways that are not uniform. Some cold cases accumulate investigative capital over time. New witnesses emerge. Forensic technology catches up to the evidence that was collected but not fully analyzable at the time. A related case breaks open and produces information that illuminates adjacent ones. The history of cold case resolution is full of cases that broke after 20 or 30 years because of DNA technology, or because of a deathbed confession, or because a piece of evidence that had been sitting in a property room for decades was reanalyzed with a technique that didn't exist when the case was opened. Those resolutions are real, and they happen with genuine frequency. But they require, in almost every instance, a foundation of physical evidence collected early in the investigation. A biological sample, a piece of material, something tangible that the original investigators preserved, and that the passage of time has not destroyed. Cases where that early evidence foundation is absent or insufficient. Cases where the terrain consumed whatever physical record existed before the investigation could secure it. Are cases where the passage of time does not accumulate investigative capital. It simply accumulates time. The trail does not get warmer with the decades. It gets colder in the specific way that involves the gradual loss of context and the gradual attrition of the living people who had any direct knowledge of the events in question. After 40 years, the witnesses who were present in August 1982 in the community surrounding Grangeville are older by 4 decades. Some of them are gone. The local knowledge that Idaho County's communities carry about their own history is genuine and deep, but it operates on living memory, and living memory has a horizon. Richard Barnett's listing remains open. 4 decades. Idaho County with its 8,500 square miles of mountain terrain pressing in from every direction around the Camas Prairie, continues to hold whatever it holds about what happened in August 1982. The record does not grow. The case does not close. The forest around Grangeville keeps its knowledge in exactly the way that forests in this part of Idaho keep everything that enters them without enough light and enough time and enough resources to be retrieved, which is to say, completely and without particular announcement, and for as long as the record stands open without a resolution to close it. The image from this case is a fading missing person listing, the kind that gets entered into a clearinghouse database in the early days of a case, and then sits there across decades as the world around it changes and the listing itself remains static, a fixed point in a record that keeps moving forward in time without carrying the case toward any resolution. A name, a date, a jurisdiction. August 31st, 1982. Grangeville, Idaho County Sheriff's Office. Still open. The next case is nearly a century old, and it has something that Richard Barnett's case and Kyle Tolley's case do not have. It has a name for what the missing person was doing in that terrain on the day he disappeared. And it has a reason, and it has the particular dread of a man who knew the country he was walking into and went anyway, because his job required it and because he trusted the landscape he had worked in for years. His name was William Teed. He was a game warden in Shoshone County in 1934. He kissed his wife Alma goodbye, packed a lunch, drove his Model A Ford to the edge of the forest at the Mullan Cemetery, and walked into the trees to catch poachers. And 90 years later, the forest around Boulder Creek has still not told anyone what it did with him. 1934. Boulder Creek, Mullan area, Shoshone County, Idaho. There is a specific quality to a disappearance that happens 90 years ago, before the infrastructure of modern missing person investigation existed in any recognizable form. Before the forensic tools and the database systems and the coordinated search protocols that we now treat as baseline expectations for a case like this were available to anyone. The events are real. The person was real. The family that was left behind was real and experienced the specific and complete devastation of an unanswered disappearance, with the same force that families experience it today. Perhaps with greater force in some ways, because the institutional resources that exist now to at least perform the function of organized pursuit, even when that pursuit doesn't produce resolution, were largely absent then. What exists instead is a record assembled from newspapers and word of mouth and the specific kind of community memory that small mountain towns in northern Idaho carry about their own history. Imperfect, selective, shaped by the passage of decades and the attrition of the people who held first-hand knowledge of the events. It is a thinner record than any modern case would produce, and it requires the same discipline that the Barnett and Tolley cases required. Tell it as the record holds it, name the gaps clearly, and do not fill the spaces between verified facts with plausible invention. What the record confirms is this. William Teed, known as Bill, was a game warden working in Shoshone County in 1934. His wife's name was Alma. He was a family man in the way that game wardens in remote mountain counties in the 1930s were family men. Embedded in the community, known to the people who lived and worked in his patrol area, carrying the particular dual identity of someone who is both a neighbor and an enforcement officer in a place where those two roles exist in tension with each other in ways that are specific and persistent and not always comfortable. A game warden in Shoshone County in 1934 was not a distant bureaucratic presence. He was a person who lived in the county, who drove its roads and walked its drainages and knew its terrain with the professional intimacy that years of patrol work produces, and who was known in return by the people who used that terrain, some of whom were using it legally and some of whom were not, and who therefore had varying relationships with the presence of a game warden in their particular corner of the woods. On the day he disappeared, Bill Teed followed a routine that Alma knew well enough to find its absence immediately alarming. He said goodbye to her in the morning, packed a lunch, and drove his Model A Ford to a specific location, the Mullan Cemetery, near the base of Boulder Creek Road in Shoshone County. This detail is precise and documented. The Mullan Cemetery is the parking point, Boulder Creek Road as the route of his intended hike into the surrounding forested area. He parked the car at the cemetery, which sits at the edge of the developed area near Mullan, and walked into the trees heading toward Boulder Gulch. The lunch he had packed was with him. The morning was ordinary in every externally observable way. He had a reason for being there, a professional reason, the kind of reason that a game warden acting in the course of his duties would have for making an unannounced approach into a specific section of backcountry on a specific day. Here's the critical detail about what had happened the day before. The day prior to his disappearance, Bill Teed had been working in the same general area and had found something. The nature of what he found is described in the documentary record as evidence. Evidence, specifically, of poaching activity in the Boulder Gulch area. He had not yet acted on what he found. He had returned home, and the following morning he went back out to Boulder Gulch on foot from the Mullan Cemetery parking point, intending to catch the poachers whose activity he had documented the day before. Alma later said that he had told her where he was going. She said also that he always told her if he would be away overnight, that it was completely unlike him to be absent without notification, and that by the time evening came and he had not returned and had not sent any word, she understood that something had gone wrong. Not that he might have extended his patrol unexpectedly. Not that plans had changed and communication had been delayed. She understood, with the specific certainty that comes from knowing a person's habits completely and recognizing their violation immediately, that something had happened in that forest that her husband had not planned for and had not been able to communicate about. This is where it stops being a disappearance and becomes, in the most practical sense, a mystery that the historical record has been unable to resolve across 9 decades. The response in 1934 was not what a modern disappearance of a law enforcement officer would generate. There were no police reports filed in a form that has survived in accessible institutional records. What knowledge exists about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Bill Teed's failure to return? The searches that may have been conducted, the areas covered, the evidence examined, the accounts given by people who might have had information about his presence in Boulder Gulch on that day, comes primarily from 2 sources: newspaper records from the Shoshone County press of that era, and the oral history that communities like Mullan carry forward through generations of local memory. Both of those sources are real and valuable, and have preserved information that would otherwise be entirely lost. Both of those sources are also, by their nature, incomplete and subject to the particular distortions that time and transmission introduce into any record that passes through multiple human hands across multiple decades. The newspaper coverage of 1934 was thorough by the standards of its time and place, and it preserved the basic facts of the case in a form that subsequent researchers have been able to work with. The community memory of Mullan has been more durable than many outsiders might expect. Small mountain towns with deep roots in specific industries and specific landscapes carry their histories with a tenacity that larger, more mobile communities often don't. But neither source provides a complete picture, and the gaps between what those sources together confirm and what would be needed to reconstruct the full sequence of events in Boulder Gulch on that day in 1934 are significant. The poacher question sits at the center of those gaps. Bill Teed went into the forest with documented knowledge of poaching activity in a specific area, intending to make contact with or apprehend people who were operating outside the law in his patrol territory. The identity of those people, whether they were known to investigators, whether they were ever questioned, whether the subsequent search for Teed included any examination of who had been active in the Boulder Gulch area in the days surrounding his disappearance, is not established in the publicly available record with sufficient clarity to state here as fact. What can be said is that the specific circumstances of his disappearance, a law enforcement officer moving toward a known location where illegal activity had been recently documented, alone in terrain where no witnesses would be present, created a set of conditions that do not resolve into any comfortable or simple explanation. An accident of terrain is possible. The backcountry around Boulder Creek in Shoshone County is demanding, and a solo patrol in that terrain carries inherent risks that exist entirely independently of any human element. But the particular combination of the prior day's discovery and the specific purpose of the return trip has sustained, across 90 years of community memory and local historical discussion, a question that the accident theory does not fully answer, and that the absence of any recovered remains has never allowed investigators to definitively close. Now this is where the case turns dark in the way that only time can produce. 90 years have passed. The fires that have burned through Shoshone County's forested terrain in the decades since 1934 have reorganized the physical landscape of the Boulder Creek area in ways that investigators and researchers have noted specifically as a factor in the absence of recovered remains. Heavy rains across 9 decades of Idaho winters and springs have moved soil and debris through drainages in ways that could have relocated physical material significant distances from the original location. The network of people who had direct knowledge of the events of that day, who was in the Boulder Gulch area, what was seen, what was known in the community about the poaching activity that Teed had documented, has been reduced by the passage of 90 years to essentially zero. There is no living witness. There is no institutional record of an investigation that was formally conducted and documented in a way that has been preserved and made accessible. The Shoshone County Sheriff's Office, when contacted by researchers and journalists who have revisited this case in recent years, has indicated that it will not release witness statements and will not conduct a new search for remains. The reasons for that position are not publicly explained in detail. The position itself means that the institutional pathway that would normally exist for a cold case re-examination of this kind is, in this instance, closed. What exists instead is the community record, the newspaper archives, the oral history, the local historians who have worked to preserve the story of Bill Teed's disappearance as a piece of Shoshone County's specific and particular history. That record has been durable enough to survive 90 years. It has been resilient enough to attract the attention of journalists and researchers in recent years who have brought the case to a wider audience than it ever reached at the time of the disappearance. And it has been specific enough to preserve the details that make the case most legible and most difficult to set aside. The Model A parked at the Mullan Cemetery, the lunch packed for a day's work in the forest, the poacher evidence found the day before, Alma's certainty that evening that something had happened that her husband had not been able to communicate about, and the particular quality of a disappearance that the terrain absorbed so completely that 9 decades of subsequent human presence in that same landscape has not produced a single physical trace. The image from this case is specific and quiet in the way that the most durable images always are. A Model A Ford parked beside a cemetery at the edge of the forest in Shoshone County, the engine cooling in the morning air. A lunch packed and uneaten. Boulder Creek Road disappearing into the trees ahead, running toward Boulder Gulch and whatever was waiting in it. And Alma at home in the evening, understanding before anyone else did that the particular silence of that house was not the silence of a man delayed on a long patrol. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that doesn't break when you listen for footsteps on the porch, or a car on the road, or any of the other sounds that would mean he was coming back. He didn't come back. The last case in this account never made national news. It didn't generate the kind of sustained media attention that puts a name on a milk carton or turns a local disappearance into a documentary subject, or brings a congressional representative to a press conference. It is a name and a date and a town in southeastern Idaho, and a listing in the long-term missing person records that has been sitting open for more than 50 years without resolution and without, in any publicly visible sense, the pressure of continued institutional pursuit. His name was Matt Mullan. He disappeared from Pocatello on July 1st, 1971. And the Port Neuf River Valley has been holding whatever it holds about that disappearance across 5 decades of Idaho's summers and winters. Without announcement and without resolution, in the specific and complete way that this state's landscapes have held every case in this account. Quietly and without remainder, and for as long as the record stays open, without something to close it. July 1st, 1971, Pocatello, Idaho. Pocatello sits in the southeastern corner of Idaho, in the Port Neuf River Valley, at the point where the Port Neuf cuts through a gap in the mountains that the Oregon Trail emigrants recognized and used, and that the railroad followed a generation later, threading its way through the same gap because geography doesn't offer that many options in this part of the state. And the ones it does offer tend to be used repeatedly across generations and purposes. The city grew up around the railroad, a division point, a repair hub, a place where the logic of industrial infrastructure pulled people in and kept them there across successive decades. And it retains the character of a working city in a way that distinguishes it from some of the smaller communities that appear in this account. Idaho State University sits at the edge of the downtown area, giving Pocatello the dual character of a railroad and industrial community that also hosts a significant academic population, a combination that has shaped the city's social texture in ways that persist today. The Port Neuf River runs through the valley floor, modest in size but important in the local landscape, moving south through terrain that transitions quickly from the city's residential and commercial districts to the agricultural land and then the mountain country that rises in every direction from the valley bottom. The Bannock Range runs along the western edge of the valley. The Pocatello Range rises to the east. The river connects the urban center to a landscape that becomes genuinely remote within a relatively short distance of the city limits. The kind of transition that Pocatello residents navigate without thinking much about it, because it is simply the geography of the place they live. Matt Mullan disappeared from Pocatello on July 1st, 1971. His case is listed with the Pocatello Police Department and appears in the long-term missing person records maintained by Idaho law enforcement clearinghouses and national missing person databases. It has been an open listing for more than 50 years. The specific details of his personal background, his age at the time of his disappearance, the particulars of his physical description beyond the basic identifying information in the official listing, the circumstances of his life in the period leading up to July 1971, what he was doing on the day he was reported missing, and what, if anything, was found at any location associated with his disappearance, are not available in the publicly accessible record with sufficient verification to state here with confidence. The discipline applied to the Tolley and Barnett cases applies here with equal force, and for the same reasons. The public record on Matt Mullan's disappearance is thin, not because the record is rich and inaccessible, but because the case was sparse from the beginning in the publicly documented sense. and the passage of 53 years has not produced the kind of media attention or renewed investigative interest that sometimes generates additional public record around old cases. What the listing confirms is the bare minimum that the listing was designed to confirm: a person, a date, a jurisdiction, an open status. Matt Amon, July 1st, 1971. Pocatello Police Department, still open. Here's what 53 years means for a missing person case in practical terms. In 1971, the national infrastructure for missing person cases was fundamentally different from what it became in subsequent decades. The National Crime Information Center had been established in 1967, but its missing person database in the early 1970s was not the comprehensive tool it later developed into. The milk carton campaigns, the clearinghouse organizations, the dedicated nonprofit networks that now maintain searchable databases of long-term missing persons and connect families with investigators and advocates. None of that existed in July 1971 in any form resembling what it would become by the 1980s and 1990s. A person who went missing from Pocatello in the summer of 1971 entered a system that was, by the standards of what followed, genuinely limited in its capacity to maintain active attention on a case that didn't resolve quickly. The local police department carried the listing. The family carried the knowledge and the grief. And the infrastructure for keeping a case visible and pressuring continued institutional attention across years and decades was, in 1971, essentially non-existent for ordinary private citizens navigating an ordinary, which is to say, non-celebrity, non-headline, disappearance in a mid-sized Idaho city. This is where it stops being an institutional history and becomes a human one. The families of people who disappear in circumstances like Matt Amon's, without a dramatic context, without a visible scene, without the kind of narrative hook that attracts sustained media attention, experience a specific and compounding form of loss that is distinct from the losses described in other cases in this account. The families of Robert Manwill and Michael Vaughn and Janelle Matthews lived through disappearances that generated immediate, large-scale public attention. Searches involving thousands of people, media coverage that kept the cases visible for extended periods, institutional resources deployed with the full weight of community recognition that something terrible had happened and that finding answers was a public priority. That attention does not resolve grief. It does not substitute for answers, but it functions as a form of acknowledgement, a confirmation in the most public and unmistakable terms that the missing person existed and mattered, and that the community understood the weight of their absence. For families navigating long-term disappearances that never generated that kind of attention, the experience is quieter and in some ways harder, because the absence of public acknowledgement can feel like a second loss layered on top of the first. The world did not stop. The city continued. The river kept moving through the valley. And the person who was gone remained gone without the public weight of a community-wide search or a media narrative to mark the significance of their absence. Matt Amon's family has carried this case for 53 years. Now this is where the geography re-enters the account, and where a recent development in the Pocatello area needs to be stated with precise care about what it is and what it is not. In 2024, skeletal remains were recovered near the Port Neuf River in Pocatello. The discovery generated local news coverage, as such discoveries do, and the identity of the remains was being investigated by authorities at the time of the most recent available reporting. The identity had not been publicly confirmed or disclosed. This detail is included here for one reason only: to note that the Port Neuf River Valley, the geographic environment most associated with Matt Amon's open listing, produced a significant forensic discovery in 2024 that is currently unresolved in the public record. What that discovery is not, and this needs to be stated with absolute clarity, is a resolution of Matt Amon's case. There is no confirmed connection between the 2024 skeletal remains discovery and Matt Amon's disappearance. The identity of those remains has not been publicly established. Drawing any connection between the two, beyond the geographical fact that both are associated with the Port Neuf River Valley, would be speculation unsupported by any verified information. So the 2024 discovery is noted here as context, as evidence that the Port Neuf River Valley continues to yield forensic information that investigators are working to interpret. And not as resolution, not as answer, not as anything that closes the 53-year gap in Matt Amon's case file. His listing remains open. The 2024 discovery is a separate thread in the same geographical fabric, being pulled in a different direction by a different investigation, and where it leads is not yet known. Here's the critical detail about what long-term cold cases do to the people who carry them. 53 years is longer than many people live. A person who was 20 years old in July 1971 when Matt Amon disappeared is in their mid-70s now. A person who was 30 is in their mid-80s. The circle of people who had direct, living, first-hand knowledge of Matt Amon's life and circumstances in the weeks and months surrounding his disappearance. The people who knew him, who saw him regularly, who might hold pieces of information about that July without necessarily understanding their significance, who could in principle be interviewed by an investigator working the case with fresh eyes and modern context. That circle has been shrinking for 53 years at the rate that human lifespans enforce. Every year the case remains open without a concerted re-examination effort is a year in which that circle contracts further, in which the living memory that might illuminate the case becomes less accessible, in which the institutional knowledge accumulated in the original investigation becomes harder to reconstruct because the investigators who conducted it are older or gone, and the records they kept are aging in whatever archive or filing system has held them across half a century. Cold cases do not age gracefully. They age in the direction of permanent unresolvability, which is not the same as permanent mystery, but produces the same outcome for the families involved. An open listing, a name in a database, a question that the institutional record cannot answer, and that the passage of time is actively working against the prospect of ever answering. For Matt Amon's family, 53 years of that process is the specific inheritance that July 1st, 1971 produced. Not the dramatic, nationally visible inheritance of a case that became a documentary subject or a legislative reform or a named law. The quieter inheritance of a listing that stays open in a database that most people never look at, and a name that most people have never heard, and a July morning in Pocatello in 1971 that the Port Neuf River Valley absorbed into its ordinary summer operations without particular announcement and without subsequent explanation. The image from this case is the simplest one in this entire account, and in some ways the most enduring. An entry in a missing person database, a name, a date, a jurisdiction, a status field that reads open in the flat, administrative language of a record-keeping system that does not distinguish between cases that were searched for by thousands of people and cases that were carried by a family alone across 53 years without resolution. Matt Amon, July 1st, 1971. Pocatello Police Department. Open. The entry looks exactly like every other entry in the database. It does not announce the wait of 53 years. It does not indicate whether anyone has looked at it recently, whether the investigation is active or dormant, whether there is anyone at the Pocatello Police Department right now who knows this case the way a case needs to be known to have any prospect of resolution. It simply sits there, in the same format as the entry beside it and the entry below it, patient and static and unresolved, the way all of these cases sit, waiting for something that the database cannot generate on its own, and that the terrain and the time and the particular silence of 53 Idaho summers have, so far, declined to provide. 10 names. And Idaho is still holding on to every one of them. The next part closes this account, not with resolution, because resolution is not available, but with the full weight of what 10 open cases look like when you hold them together on the same map and let the geography of this state speak for itself about what it keeps and what it returns and what it holds in the specific, permanent silence of its backcountry and its canals and its mountain highways and its small-town streets where children played on summer evenings and a film crew worked in the shadow of a cliff and a game warden packed a lunch and drove his Model A to the edge of the trees and a 12-year-old girl was dropped at her front door after a Christmas concert, and none of them, in any final sense, came all the way back. Pull the map back out. The one from the beginning, the aerial view, Idaho spreading wide under a gray sky, the sawtooth peaks cutting white along the horizon, the single campground road threading between the pines with one way in and one way out. We started there because that image is accurate in a way that extends beyond any single campground in Lemhi County. It is accurate as a description of what this state does with the people it takes. One way in. And then, for these 10 people, no way out that anyone has been able to document or follow or resolve in all the years since. 10 cases. 10 locations scattered across a state that covers 83,000 square miles of terrain, ranging from high desert basin to alpine wilderness, to agricultural flatland, to mountain canyon country. And that contains within that range essentially every variety of landscape in which a human being can cease to be findable. The cases in this account span 87 years. From a game warden who parked his Model A at the edge of the Shoshone County Forest in 1934, to a 5-year-old in a light blue Minecraft shirt who was seen by his neighbors on a summer evening in Fruitland in 2021, and then was not seen by anyone again. 87 years of Idaho history, across 8 different counties, across terrain that ranges from a dense urban apartment complex beside a Boise canal, to a 4-million-acre national forest in the Clearwater, to a 2-lane Palouse highway running between wheat fields in the long northern Idaho dusk. 8 decades of improvements in search technology, forensic capability, database infrastructure, and interagency coordination. And 10 cases that none of those improvements, across their respective spans of open status, have been able to close. Campgrounds and canals, mountain highways and remote forest corridors, suburban streets and small-town neighborhoods, and a cemetery parking lot at the edge of the trees where a man left his Model A Ford one morning and walked into the forest with a packed lunch and a reason and did not come back. A corridor of highway in the northern Palouse country where at least 5 people were taken across a 3-year period and the person responsible has never been identified. A child's blanket and sippy cup and toy monkey arranged on a campsite table with the casual certainty of someone who fully intends to return. Footprints in December snow, raked smooth by someone who understood they were evidence and took the time, in the cold outside a family's house on a Thursday evening after a Christmas concert, to remove them before walking away. These are not the same story. They are 10 different stories connected only by the geography that contains them and by the single fact of their unresolved status. The open listing, the unanswered question, the family still carrying the weight of a July morning or a December evening or an October afternoon in the forest that has not, in any of these 10 cases, been given a final explanation that closes the file and returns something to the people who were left behind. Here is what you pulled up the map to find, and here is what the map gives back. A campsite in Lemhi County, where a 2-year-old's belongings sat undisturbed while a decade of professional searches covered the surrounding terrain without finding a single trace of a child who was present at that location on that afternoon. And then was not. A cliff edge in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, where a dropped 2-way radio lies in the dirt. And a young producer from Maryland who lived in London ran faster than anyone on that film crew had ever seen anyone run and disappeared into 4 million acres of mountain forest before a single searcher was deployed. The entire critical window of scent evidence and physical trail closing overnight, while the terrain worked over whatever record existed. A Fruitland neighborhood where a 5-year-old in a light blue Minecraft shirt was seen by people who knew him, and then was not seen by anyone, while hundreds of acres of corn were harvested ahead of schedule to clear the ground for a search that found nothing. And a police chief said publicly that he believed the child was dead, and that the people who knew what happened were still living in the community. And a street named Red Wing became the geographic center of an investigation that has not produced remains and has not produced a murder charge in 3 years of sustained effort. A Boise canal running south toward Kuna in the July heat, carrying what it carried while 2,300 searchers walked its banks, and a detective sat with a timeline that didn't add up at its edges and knew, before the canal confirmed it on August 3rd, what kind of case this actually was. A Colorado house on a December evening with footprints in the snow that someone raked smooth before walking away. And a 12-year-old girl who was dropped at her front door after a Christmas concert and didn't make it inside. And 35 years of silence broken by oil workers in a Weld County field in the summer of 2019, and a 2022 conviction of a man who had run for governor of Idaho, and whose obsessive public interest in the case across decades turned out to reflect something other than civic concern. A mountain pullout somewhere along Highway 21 east of Boise, where the ponderosa pine presses in close from both sides, and the afternoon thunderclouds build over the ridgeline the way they build every August in the Boise National Forest, and a name in a clearinghouse listing that has been sitting open for 23 years without the scene details that would allow anyone to reconstruct what happened in that corridor on that specific August day in 2001. A 2-lane highway sign between Genesee and Moscow reflecting headlights in the dark, and at least 5 people taken from the corridor it marks across a 3-year window by someone who has never been identified, never been named publicly as a suspect, and never been charged with anything connected to any of those disappearances across 50 years of cold case investigation. A fading entry in a long-term missing person database with a date in August 1982, and a jurisdiction and an open status, and more than 4 decades of silence behind it in Idaho County, the largest county in the state. 8,500 square miles of mountain terrain that keeps its contents with the completeness that terrain of that scale and that character has always kept them. A Model A, Ford parked beside a cemetery in Shoshone County, the engine cooling in the morning air. Boulder Creek Road disappearing into the trees ahead, a game warden walking toward a section of forest where he had found evidence of poaching the day before. And his wife Alma at home that evening, understanding with immediate and complete certainty that the silence of the house was not the silence of a man delayed on a long patrol. And 90 years since then, in which that forest has not produced a single physical trace of what happened to him in it. And a name in a Pocatello database, July 1st, 1971, 53 years open. The Port Neuf River Valley continuing its ordinary operations in every direction around the listing without announcement and without the resolution that half a century of open status has not been able to generate. Here's the critical detail that holds all 10 of these cases together in a way that no single explanation can account for. None of them are the same kind of case. The circumstances are different. The terrains are different. The eras are different. The institutional responses were different, and the levels of public attention brought to bear on each of them varied enormously. From the nationally visible milk carton case of a 12-year-old Colorado girl with an Idaho killer, to the quiet, sparse listing of a man who disappeared from a mountain highway corridor in Boise County in 2001 without generating enough public record to reconstruct the basic scene details. What these cases share is not a cause, not a method, not a single connecting thread that runs through all 10 of them and resolves into an explanation. What they share is a state, and within that state, a specific and recurring outcome. The landscape absorbed them, and the record stayed open, and the families kept carrying the question forward into each new year without the answer that would allow them to put it down. This is where it stops being a case file and becomes something else. You pulled up the map at the beginning of this account because maps are how we organize the geography of what we know into something navigable. You can find Lemhi County on a map. You can find the Highway 21 corridor and the Lewis-Clark Valley and Shoshone County and Pocatello and the Camas Prairie and Fruitland on the Snake River's western edge. You can trace the routes that connect these places, the highways and the forest roads and the campground access roads and the canal systems and the river valleys, and produce something that looks like a coherent picture of a state with a documented geography of loss. But the map doesn't show the gaps. It doesn't show the space between a 2-year-old's campsite and wherever he went. It doesn't show the terrain between a cliff edge in the Clearwater and the point where a young man stopped being visible to the people who were shouting his name into the timber. It doesn't show the distance between a Fruitland yard on a summer evening and wherever a 5-year-old's remains were moved to after the search intensified around a specific street address. It doesn't show what moves through a Boise canal at night in July, or what the December snow in a Colorado driveway looked like after someone had finished smoothing it over. Maps show roads and terrain features and jurisdictional lines. They show you where places are. They do not show you what the terrain keeps, or how long it keeps it, or under what conditions, if any, it eventually gives something back. Now this is where the account closes, and it closes without resolution because resolution is not available. And offering a false version of closure would be a specific and identifiable dishonesty about what these 10 cases actually are, and what the families connected to them are still living inside. 10 names, 10 open listings, a campground in Lemhi County that still gets searched every summer by people who have not stopped looking and still gives nothing back. A flyer with a 5-year-old's face on it and the word monkey in bold letters and a phone number that has been active for 3 years without producing the answer it was printed to find. A detective sitting with a timeline that doesn't hold together at its edges on the morning of day 2, while the canal moves south through the July heat and 2,300 people are still walking the banks looking for a child who is already in the water. A Model A Ford beside a cemetery, and a lunch that was packed for a day's work in the forest and never eaten and never found. A highway sign between 2 small Palouse towns reflecting headlights in the dark, with no record of who passed it in 1979 and 1980 and 1981. And what happened to them on the road beyond it, and who made that happen, and where that person is now. A database entry from July 1st, 1971, sitting open in the same flat administrative format as every other entry around it. Patient and static and unannounced across 53 years of Idaho's summers and winters. You pulled up the map. You locked your doors. But some of these places never let go. And the people connected to these 10 cases are living proof of what it means to keep asking a question that the landscape has, so far, declined to answer. 10 names. Still open. A slow pull back off the map now. The sawtooth peaks at the edge of the frame. The campground road, one way in, one way out, receding as the aerial view widens. Idaho spreading below, 83,000 square miles of terrain that contains within it everything this account has described and everything it hasn't, because these were only the ones we can name.